The words hit me like shards of glass. You're not my bio mom, so why should I care what you think? 17-year-old Marcus stood in our kitchen doorway, his graduation cap crooked on his head, his eyes cold and distant as winter stones. I felt my carefully constructed world collapse in that single moment. 12 years of motherhood reduced to a biological technicality. My name is Elena Vesquez. I'm 43 years old, and until that Tuesday evening in May, I believed I knew exactly who I was. I'm a high school literature teacher in Portland, Oregon, living in the same craftsman house where I've spent the last decade trying to build something that felt like home. I've always been the type of person who reads the last page of a book first, not because I lack patience, but because I need to know that everything will work out before I can fully invest in the journey. Life, however, doesn't offer that luxury. Marcus came into my life when he was 5. A quiet boy with his father's dark eyes and a way of watching the world that made me think he was cataloging everything for some future use. David, my husband, had been divorced for 2 years when we met, and Marcus spent weekends with us initially, then every other week, then after his mother Lisa moved to Los Angeles for work, he came to live with us permanently when he was 7. I remember the exact moment I fell in love with that child. It was a Saturday morning, and he was sitting at our kitchen table, methodically eating cereal and reading the back of the milk carton with the intense concentration of a scholar. He looked up at me and said, "Elena, did you know that cows have 4 stomachs? That seems inefficient." The way he said my name, not tentatively, not with the careful politeness children reserve for adults they're unsure about, but matter-of-factly, as if I had always belonged in his world, made something inside my chest expand and settle. I never pushed him to call me mom. David had been careful about that, and I respected the delicate ecology of a blended family. But Marcus began doing it naturally around age 9, usually when he was excited or upset. "Mom, look at this," when he discovered a particularly interesting beetle in the garden. "Mom, I don't feel good," whispered into the darkness when a stomach bug struck in the middle of the night. Those moments felt like small miracles, each one a thread weaving us together into something that felt unbreakable. For 10 years I showed up for everything. School plays where Marcus played a tree and took his role with deadly seriousness. Soccer games where he warmed the bench, but still needed someone to cheer his name. Science fairs, parent-teacher conferences, doctor's appointments, driving lessons, college application. I bandaged scraped knees, helped with algebra homework, negotiated curfews, and held him when his first girlfriend broke his heart. I loved him with the fierce, protective intensity that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. The daily choice to show up, to care, to be present for another human being's entire existence. David and I never had children together. It wasn't a conscious decision initially. We were simply focused on raising Marcus and building our careers. By the time we seriously discussed it, I was 38, and after a year of trying and 2 miscarriages, we decided we were complete as we were. Marcus was our child, and I was his mother in every way that mattered. Or so I believed. The change began subtly last fall, around the time Marcus started his senior year. Lisa had moved back to Portland with her new husband, a successful architect who'd made it clear he wanted to establish a relationship with Marcus. Suddenly there were more phone calls to Mom, his biological mother, and weekend visits that stretched longer than planned. Marcus began correcting people who referred to me as his mother. "She's my stepmother," he would say, not unkindly, but with a precision that felt like a blade. I told myself it was normal, even healthy. A 17-year-old boy reconnecting with his biological mother, establishing his identity separate from the family he'd grown up in. I buried my hurt beneath layers of rational understanding and continued doing what I'd always done, loving him unconditionally. But the distance grew. Conversations became stilted. When I attended his final soccer game of the season, he didn't run to hug me afterward like he had for years. Instead, he went straight to Lisa, who had arrived late and spent most of the game on her phone. I stood on the sidelines, watching my son, and yes, he was my son regardless of DNA, embrace the woman who'd given birth to him, but had missed most of his childhood. The graduation ceremony was set for Thursday evening, followed by a small family dinner at our house. Marcus had been accepted to Oregon State for engineering, and despite the growing chasm between us, I was proud beyond measure. I'd helped him with his essays, driven him to campus visits, celebrated with him when the acceptance letter arrived. This achievement belonged to all of us. That Tuesday I'd come home from school to find Marcus in the kitchen, still wearing his cap and gown from the rehearsal. He was standing with Lisa and her husband Steve, and they were all laughing about something. The scene looked natural, like a family portrait I'd never been invited to pose for. "How did the rehearsal go?" I asked, setting down my bag of papers to grade. "Fine," Marcus replied without looking at me. "Mom and Steve are taking me out to celebrate tonight." Something twisted in my stomach. I thought we were having dinner together as a family. That's when Lisa spoke up, her voice carrying that particular brand of sweetness that barely conceals its poison. "Well, Elena, I appreciate everything you've done, truly. But now that Marcus is becoming an adult, it's important for him to spend time with his real family. You understand?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for months. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to correct her, to tell her that I was real family, that the 12 years I'd spent raising him counted for something. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and wouldn't meet my eyes. "Marcus," I said carefully, "you know I consider myself your real family too." That's when he looked up, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a cold dismissal that froze my blood. "You're not my bio mom, so why should I care what you think?" The silence that followed felt infinite. Lisa had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but she didn't correct him. Steve examined his fingernail, and Marcus, my Marcus, who I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms and taught to drive and help through every milestone of his adolescence, simply stood there, waiting for me to absorb this blow. I managed to nod and walk to my bedroom, closing the door with the kind of careful control that comes from years of teaching teenagers. Only then did I allow myself to fall apart. I sat on the edge of the bed that David and I shared, in the house where Marcus had grown from a small boy into a young man, and wept for the relationship I thought we'd built together. David found me there an hour later, after Lisa and Steve had left and Marcus had gone upstairs. My husband held me while I told him what had happened, and I felt his own heartbreak in the way his arms tightened around me. "He doesn't mean it," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He's just confused right now, trying to figure out where he belongs." "What if he does mean it?" I whispered. "What if all these years I've been fooling myself into thinking I mattered to him?" That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself standing in the doorway of Marcus's room, watching him sleep as I had when he was small and feverish, or scared, or simply because I loved the peaceful expression on his face in slumber. How many nights had I stood here, marveling at the privilege of being this child's mother? How many times had I whispered silent promises to always be there for him, no matter what? The next morning Marcus was distant but not cruel. He accepted the lunch I'd packed for him, and thanked me politely when I reminded him about picking up his cap and gown from the dry cleaner. We moved around each other like careful strangers, both pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted in our universe. I spent that day at school in a fog, teaching Romeo and Juliet to sophomores who were more interested in summer vacation than Shakespearean tragedy. During my planning period, I found myself thinking about the families in literature, the biological bonds that could be broken, the chosen bonds that often proved stronger than blood. I thought about how adoption had been portrayed throughout history, how step-parents were often relegated to villain roles in fairy tales, how the narrative of real family had been constructed to exclude people like me. It was during lunch that I made my decision. I would write Marcus a letter, not a confrontational one, not an attempt to guilt him into loving me, but an honest account of what our relationship had meant to me. I would give it to him after graduation, with no expectations attached. If he read it, fine. If he threw it away, that would be fine too. I needed to say these things, even if he never wanted to hear them. I spent Wednesday evening crafting that letter, choosing each word with the care I usually reserved for lesson plan. I wrote about the moment I'd first held his hand crossing the street when he was 6, how his small fingers had trusted mine completely. I wrote about the night he'd had pneumonia and how I'd slept in the chair beside his bed, checking his breathing every few minutes. I wrote about teaching him to tie his shoes, to ride a bike, to parallel park. I wrote about the pride I'd felt watching him grow from a shy little boy into a confident young man. But mostly I wrote about love, not the desperate clinging kind, but the steady, unconditional love that asks for nothing in return except the chance to exist. I told him that biology might determine where we come from, but choice determines who we become. I told him that I'd chosen to be his mother every single day for 12 years, and that nothing, not his words, not his rejection, Not even his absence from my life could undo those years or diminish their meaning. I sealed the letter in a simple white envelope with his name written in my careful teacher's handwriting. Then I placed it in my purse and tried to prepare myself for graduation day. Thursday arrived gray and drizzly, typical for Portland in late May. The ceremony was held in the school auditorium, and I arrived early to secure good seats for our family. David, myself, Lisa and Steve. Marcus would be sitting with his classmates, but I wanted to see his face when he walked across the stage. The afternoon proceeded with the familiar rhythm of high school graduations everywhere. Speeches about bright futures and limitless possibilities. The calling of names in alphabetical order. I watched Marcus file in with his class, his mortarboard perfectly straight now, his face serious and focused. When his name was called, Marcus David Thompson, I felt the familiar surge of pride that had nothing to do with whose DNA he carried. After the ceremony, families clustered in the hallway, taking pictures and exchanging congratulations. Marcus found us quickly, accepting hugs from his father and biological mother, shaking hands formally with Steve. When he reached me, he hesitated for just a moment before giving me a brief, polite hug. "Congratulations," I said, meaning it with all my heart. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Elena," he replied, and the use of my first name instead of Mom felt like a door closing. We drove home in separate cars. Marcus rode with Lisa and Steve while David and I followed behind. The dinner I'd planned felt surreal, sitting around our dining room table, the table where Marcus had done homework and eaten birthday cake and had countless family meals, making small talk with people who felt like strangers. After dinner, as everyone prepared to leave, I quietly handed Marcus the envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Just something I wanted you to have," I said. "You don't have to read it now, or ever, really. But I wanted you to have it." He looked at the envelope for a moment, then slipped it into his jacket pocket without another word. They left shortly after, and David and I were alone in our suddenly too quiet house. I didn't hear from Marcus for 3 weeks. Not a text, not a call, not even a response to the congratulations card I'd sent to his mother's house. I forced myself to accept that this might be how our story ended. Not with drama or confrontation, but with a simple fading away, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Then on a Tuesday evening in mid-June, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and my heart stopped for a moment before I answered. "Elena." His voice sounded different, younger somehow, uncertain. "Hi Marcus, how are you? I read your letter." A long pause. "I read it the night you gave it to me, actually. I've been thinking about it ever since." I waited, afraid to speak and break whatever spell had prompted this call. "I want to see you," he continued. "Can I come over? I know Dad's at his conference in Seattle." "Of course. You're always welcome here." He arrived 45 minutes later, still wearing the same jacket he'd had at graduation. I could see the envelope sticking out of his pocket, creased now from handling. We sat in the living room, where he'd once built elaborate Lego cities and later studied for the SATs. "I've been angry," he said without preamble. "Not at you exactly, at everything. At the divorce, at Mom leaving, at feeling like I had to choose between family. It's easier to push people away than to risk losing them again." I nodded, understanding flooding through me. "You were 5 when your parents divorced. That's a lot for a little boy to process." I never processed it though. I just adapted, and when Mom came back, it brought up all these feelings I'd buried. I felt guilty for loving you, like I was betraying her somehow, and I felt guilty for resenting her, because she is my biological mother. Love isn't finite, Marcus. You don't have to ration it or choose sides. He pulled the letter from his pocket, and I could see it had been folded and unfolded many times. "You wrote that you chose to be my mother every day. I never thought about it like that before. I always thought love was just something that happened automatically. But you're right, it's a choice." We talked for 3 hours that night. He told me about the pressure he'd felt from Lisa to distance himself from me. The subtle comments about real family and blood relations that had slowly poisoned his thinking. He told me about the guilt he'd carried for years, feeling like he was living between 2 worlds and never fully belonging to either. I told him about my own journey, how I'd learned that motherhood wasn't about biology but about showing up, day after day, for another person's life. I told him about the fear I'd carried since his words at graduation. Not just the fear of losing him, but the fear that maybe I'd been deluding myself about our bond all along. "You weren't deluding yourself," he said finally. "You are my mom, not my bio mom, but my real mom, the one who was there for everything that mattered." The healing didn't happen overnight. Trust, once broken, requires time and consistent action to rebuild. But we began having coffee together once a week, and gradually, the easy communication we'd always shared returned. Marcus started college in the fall, and he called regularly, not just when he needed something but to share small moments from his daily life. Lisa and I eventually had our own conversation, a difficult but necessary clearing of the air. She admitted that her return to Portland had been motivated partly by guilt over the years she'd missed, and that she'd unfairly positioned me as competition rather than seeing me as the woman who'd loved her son in her absence. We would never be close, but we found a way to coexist peacefully in Marcus's life. It's been 2 years since graduation now. Marcus is thriving in college, studying engineering as planned, but also taking creative writing classes that surprise no one who knows him well. He brings friends home sometimes, and I love watching him navigate our house with the unconscious familiarity of someone who belongs here. He still calls me Mom, and the word has regained its weight and meaning. Last month he asked if I'd help him with his scholarship essay for next year. The topic was a person who changed your life. As I read his rough draft, tears blurred my vision. He'd written about me, not as his stepmother or the woman who'd married his father, but as his mother, the woman who'd taught him that family is built on choice, commitment, and love, the woman who'd shown him that showing up, day after day, is the truest form of devotion. Biomom, he'd written in the conclusion, is just a scientific term. Real mom is the person who chooses to love you unconditionally, who believes in your potential even when you don't believe in yourself, who teaches you that love is a verb, not just a feeling. I think about that 17-year-old boy who stood in our kitchen and tried to reduce our relationship to biology, and I feel nothing but compassion for him now. He was trying to navigate an impossible situation with the limited emotional tools of adolescence. The words that felt like betrayal were actually the confused outcry of a young man trying to understand where he belonged in a complicated world. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always look like revenge or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a phone call on a Tuesday evening, a letter read and reread until its edges are soft with handling. A relationship rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and choice rather than assumption and biology. I still teach literature, still find myself drawing connections between the stories on the page and the stories we live. But I understand now that the best stories, the ones that leave the deepest impression, are often quiet ones about ordinary people choosing to love each other, despite the pain and complexity that love inevitably brings. Marcus graduates from college next spring. He's already asked if I'll be there front row center to watch him walk across the stage, and I will be because that's what mothers do. We show up, we choose love, and we celebrate our children's triumphs as if they were our own, because they are.